The cold came for her the way her husband used to, without warning from the north, all weight and intention. Nora ran. She did not think the word run. Her legs had decided before her mind caught up, and she was moving through the dark scrub with her shawl held at her throat and her boots punching through the crust of snow that had hardened since nightfall. Behind her, the Callaway Ranch bled orange light from two windows, and somewhere inside it Hector was deciding whether to be embarrassed or enraged. She knew from 10 years of reading the way he stood in doorways which it would be. She did not look back to find out. The desert at night in January was a different country than the one she knew by day. The saguaros became sentinels. The rock formations became something older than language. The sky above the Superstition Mountains held its stars with such indifference that looking at them made her feel, briefly, free of her own body. And then her foot went through the snow into an unseen rock hollow, and pain shot from her ankle to her hip, and she nearly went down. She caught herself on a creosote branch that sliced her palm. She stood there breathing steam into the dark, listening. Wind, distant yip of a coyote, nothing that wore boots. Keep moving. The hand, the palm, she had stood at a window once and watched her mother press her own cut palm flat against the glass, and she was 7, and she had wanted to put her hand on the other side of the glass, matching. But her mother had looked through her like she was the window itself, not the girl standing before it. Nora pressed her bleeding palm against her coat and kept moving. She did not know how long she walked. The cold had a way of eating time. What she knew was that her ankle had swollen inside her boot, and the stars had rotated overhead, and the lights of the ranch had been gone so long she'd stopped looking for them. The desert floor had climbed into the foothills without her noticing, and now she was among boulders and pine, and the cold was a different animal up here, drier, with teeth. She was not going to freeze to death. She said it aloud to hear it. The sound fell flat against the rocks and came back nothing. The fire she saw was small and deliberate. A man who knew what he was doing with fire, which meant a man who had reasons to be controlled. She stopped behind a boulder and studied it. One figure seated, a horse standing easy. The posture of a man who had been in one place long enough to be comfortable, but who had also placed himself with his back to the largest rock, and his sight line clear in every direction except the one she stood in. She had two choices: walk toward the fire or continue through the dark and cold with a foot that was wrong in a way she didn't want to examine. The thing in her sternum, that locked thing she had carried so long, she'd stopped remembering it wasn't structural, tightened another degree. She walked toward the fire. He heard her before she made 10 steps. She saw his hand move to his side and then still. He did not stand. He watched her come out of the dark and into the firelight, and she stood at the edge of it with her bleeding hand held against her coat and her hair destroyed by wind and her ankle folded slightly sideways inside her boot. He was Apache. She understood that immediately and did not run. She was done with what she was running from. Whatever this was, it was different. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older, the kind of face that had stopped counting years in favor of other measurements. High flat cheekbones, a scar along the left jaw, old enough to have settled into the skin as simple geography. He wore a wool blanket over leather, and his eyes moved across her with the efficient attention of someone assessing a situation rather than a person. "You are cold," he said, not a question. His English had an accent she couldn't place formal in the way of someone who had learned it from documents rather than conversation. "I am," she said. "Your foot." "My ankle, I twisted it." He looked at her palm. "And your hand." She looked down at it. The cut had bled more than she'd known. Her coat was dark with it. "It's not deep," she said. He said something in his own language that she thought might be disagreement. Then he gestured to the fire, not to the ground beside him, to the other side of it, which gave them the fire between them, which was more consideration than she had expected from anyone. She sat. The heat arrived at her face like something she'd forgotten existed. She put both hands toward it, and the cold began its slow retreat from her fingers. "Where were you going?" he said, with a broken ankle and a cut hand and no horse. Away, she said. He nodded once, as though this was a sufficient answer. My name is Kohana, he said. I am going north with first light. Nora, she said, then, I have nowhere to be. He reached into a pack beside him and produced a strip of cloth and a small pot. He set the pot in the coals. The smell of something herbal and sharp rose from it as it warmed. You will stay until morning, he said. Then we will see what the ankle says. It was not an offer exactly. It was also not a command. It occupied some third thing she didn't have a word for, a statement of practical fact, delivered without expectation of gratitude or resistance. She held her hands toward the fire and let it do its work and said nothing, and what it felt like, the heat, was not something she could name. It lived somewhere in the space between her shoulder blades, which had not unclenched in 10 years. She did not sleep. She told herself she would not sleep, and she didn't, not completely, though she may have drifted once in the warmest part of the night because she blinked, and the stars had moved. Kohana slept in brief intervals. She could see him do it, the precise way a man sleeps who has trained himself to wake at nothing, and in his waking intervals he tended the fire with the same economy he seemed to bring to everything. At one point he looked across the fire at her and said, "The man you ran from, he will come looking." "Maybe," she said. Here, he reached across the fire and she did not flinch. She noticed the not flinching, the way it was almost remarkable, and he set a piece of dried meat in her palm. "Eat." She ate. The sky lightened from black to a color that had no name and then to a color that had many names. And then the sun came over the eastern ridge and turned the snow on the high rocks to copper, and Kohana rose and looked at her ankle and made that sound in his own language again. "You cannot walk on this," he said. "I can." "You can," he agreed, "but not far and not fast. If the man comes, you cannot run." She looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," he said carefully, like he was choosing each word from a larger supply, "that you should come north with me. My camp is 3 days. The ankle will be treated. In 3 days you will be far enough that a man who is embarrassed does not bother to travel." She studied him across the remains of the fire. She had studied men her entire life. It was the primary skill her life had required of her, and what she could read in him was patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for something. The patience of someone who simply did not need things to be other than they were. "Why?" she said. He looked at the mountains. "You came out of the dark toward a stranger's fire," he said. "I have done that also." He turned back to her. "We are not so different." It was the strangest thing anyone had said to her in 10 years of marriage, and it sat somewhere beneath her collarbone like a stone dropped into still water. 3 days, she said. 3 days. She stood. Her ankle sent a hard complaint up her leg, and she did not make a sound. He watched her stand with no expression that she could read as pity, which was the first gift. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes." "Good." He turned to the horse. "Then we go." The camp was not what she expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. It sat in a canyon that the winter hadn't found the way into yet, sheltered on 3 sides by red rock walls, threaded through with a spring that ran even in January. There were perhaps 30 people. Women, children, older men. The young men were gone, she gathered, on some business she was not told. Kohana's return was received with the attention of a man whose comings and goings mattered. Not ceremony, practicality. A woman of perhaps 60 came immediately to look at Nora's ankle, and whatever she saw made her click her tongue and begin a conversation with Kohana that Nora could not follow. "She says the ankle is badly swollen," Kohana translated. "She will make a poultice. You are to stay off it for 3 days. "I gathered some of that," Nora said. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile. "Her name is Ishke. She will tell you where to sleep and what to eat. I have business to attend to." He walked away. She watched him go, and then Ishke took her arm with the grip of someone accustomed to guiding things that needed guiding, and steered her toward a low structure of hides and woven brush. The next 2 days she moved in a small radius. Her ankle was bound with something that smelled like pine and cooling, whatever plant Ishke had used, and it helped more than she would have believed. She was given food without ceremony: dried meat, corn cake, something root-based and hot that she could not identify. She ate all of it. The women watched her with interest that was not unfriendly and not exactly friendly either. She was a thing to be assessed. She understood that. She had assessed things her whole life. Kohana passed through her sight line several times a day but did not approach. This, too, she noticed. He was not avoiding her. He was simply occupied. And when his path and her path crossed at the fire in the evening, once at the spring, he spoke to her with the same matter-of-fact directness, asked after the ankle, said something to Ishke about her progress. On the second morning, she woke to find a child sitting approximately 2 feet from her face, staring at her with enormous gravity. "Good morning," Nora said. The child, a girl, perhaps 5, considered this, then said something in Apache. "I don't speak your language," Nora said. More Apache. The child pointed at Nora's hair, which was red and which was, Nora had come to understand, of genuine interest to the camp. "It's just hair," Nora said. The child reached out and touched it. Nora held very still. The child's fingers were careful, like she was handling something that might startle. "Bidziel," the child announced, with great satisfaction, and then stood and walked away. Kohana was passing. He had seen this. There was something in his face she had not seen before, and it was here and gone before she could name it. "What did she say?" Nora asked. "She said your hair is strong," he said. "It is a compliment. She would not touch something weak." He continued on his way. Nora watched him go. That evening he sat near her at the fire, which was different from the previous 2 evenings. Not close, but within conversation. "Your husband," he said without preamble, "how long?" 10 years. He was quiet. "He was not always the way he was at the end," she said, and then stopped, because that was a lie she'd told herself so many times it had started to sound true. "Actually, he was always the way he was. I was different. I learned to see it differently." Kohana looked into the fire. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Sickness." A pause that held many things. She was the person who could say a thing that made it less heavy. Nora looked at the fire also. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yes," he said, as though agreeing that sorrow was the correct word. They sat in the quiet for a while, and the fire did what fires do. "The ankle," he said finally. "Ishke says you can move tomorrow, carefully." "I'll be careful." He looked at her then, directly, for the first time in 2 days, and what was in it was not assessment. It was something she didn't have a word for and did not try to find one. "You are welcome here," he said, "as long as the ankle needs." She looked back at the fire. The place beneath her collarbone, the stone she'd felt drop there at his first fire, was warm now. It had been warming for 2 days, and she had not had a word for that either. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and rose and went to the other side of the camp, and she stayed at the fire until it burned down to coals. On the 3rd day she could walk without favoring it too badly. Ishke removed the poultice, examined the ankle with the same click of her tongue that seemed to serve as her primary form of commentary, and rewrapped it with something cleaner. Nora had begun to learn 3 or 4 words of Apache, which Ishke found either amusing or acceptable. It was hard to tell the difference. Kohana found her in the afternoon at the edge of the camp, where the red rock began its climb. She was watching a hawk work the thermals above the canyon rim. "Come," he said, "I want to show you something." He took her up a trail cut into the rock face that she would not have found on her own. It vanished and reappeared, more idea than path. Her ankle protested on the steeper sections but held. She did not mention it, and he set a pace she could keep. The trail opened onto a ledge perhaps 20 feet wide, facing west, above the entire valley. In the afternoon light, the desert below them was every shade of amber and rust, and the shadows of the clouds moved across it like slow animals. "My wife found this place," he said. He sat on a flat rock at the ledge's edge. She sat beside him, not close. Close enough. She said it was where the sky practiced before it went east. Nora looked at the sky. It was the kind of sky that made her feel the specific loneliness of beauty, the feeling that something this large should not be experienced alone. "She was right," Nora said. "She was right about many things," he said. "She was wrong about some. That is the nature of people." He paused. "Tell me about your mother." The question arrived without warning, and it landed somewhere between her ribs. "Why?" "You pressed your hand against your coat," he said. "When you were bleeding, not to stop the blood, the gesture, it was old." She looked at him. He had seen that. He had been reading her the way she had been reading him, and this knowledge moved through her chest like a current of water beneath ice. "My mother was," she started. "She was not a cruel woman, she was an absent one, which is its own kind of cold." She looked at the valley. "I married Hector because he noticed me. That is all it took. Someone who looked directly at me." Kohana was quiet. "I learned later that looking directly was also how he owned things," she said. "He looked at his horse that way, his land. And now, I am on a rock above a desert talking to a man I did not know 4 days ago." "Yes," he said, "we are both that." The sun moved, and the shadows of the canyon walls began to climb the rock faces on the east. It was cold in the shade, but the ledge held the last of the direct light, and she did not want to leave it. She became aware at some point that she could not have marked precisely, that the distance between them had diminished. Not by much. By the amount a person shifts when they have stopped holding themselves carefully apart from something. She had shifted. She did not move back. His hand on the rock between them was still. She looked at it. Large hand, careful hand, the knuckles of a man who used his hands for things. She did not touch it, but she looked at it for a long time, and when she looked up he was watching her, and what passed between them in that moment was not declared or named. It settled into her body like the heat of the fire had, below the collarbone, in the loosening place at the base of her throat. They came down from the ledge as the sun finished, and the canyon fell into its blue early evening light. At the bottom of the trail she favored her ankle on a loose rock, and he put his hand at her elbow to steady her. The first time he had touched her since lifting her onto his horse 4 days ago, and the warmth of it moved from her elbow upward, and she did not want him to let go, and he held until she was steady, and then he did let go, and she was aware of the exact shape of her elbow where his hand had been. Ishke watched them walk back into the camp with an expression that communicated, in the universal language of older women who have watched people for many decades, that she had already known exactly how this would go. The man came on the 4th morning. Nora heard him before she saw him, the sound of a horse pushed too hard on uncertain ground. She came out of the shelter, and the camp had already oriented itself toward the canyon entrance. The women had moved the children. Kohana stood at the center of the camp with 2 other men, and his posture was the posture of a man who had already made several decisions. Hector Calloway rode in hard and pulled up short when he saw the number of people watching him. He was a big man, red-faced, with the kind of bluster that worked well in rooms but had always needed walls to bounce off of. The open desert made it look thin. He saw Nora. "Get on the horse," he said. She did not move. Something in Hector's face recalibrated. He had expected compliance. He had always gotten compliance, eventually, from everything. It was the premise on which he had built his entire life. He looked at Kohana, then at the men on either side of Kohana. "She's my wife," he said. "She came here on her own," Kohana said. His voice was level, carrying no more weight than the situation required. "She has not said she wants to leave. I don't need her to say it." Hector's hand moved toward his hip, and the men in the camp moved also, a small readjustment of standing positions, and Hector's hand stilled. The cold in Nora's sternum was not fear. She had learned the difference. Fear was a closing thing. This was different. This was open, clarifying like a window raised. "Nora," Kohana said without looking at her, "what do you want?" The question was so simple it was almost unkind. 10 years of her life had contained no version of it. She had been asked what was for dinner and whether she'd finished her chores and why she was in that tone of voice, and had she gone soft in the head. She had not been asked what she wanted. "I'm not going back," she said. Hector's face did the thing she had seen it do perhaps 40 times and had learned to read the way she'd learned to read weather. The redness deepened and then settled, and then he was deciding. She could see him decide. She had always seen him decide, and had always been on the side of the decision that cost her something. "You think these people will protect you," he said. It was not really a question. "I'm not asking anyone to protect me," she said. "I'm telling you I'm not coming." Hector looked at Kohana. Kohana looked back at him with the patience of a rock wall. There are men who back down because they calculate the odds, and there are men who back down because they encounter something they cannot read and cannot control, and their bluster requires an audience that will be afraid of them. Kohana was not afraid. The men beside him were not afraid. Nora, and this was the thing that moved through Hector's face like a shadow, Nora was not afraid. He turned his horse. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is," Nora said. He rode out of the canyon at a different pace than he'd ridden in. She stood in the space he'd left, and the cold January air came down from the canyon rim, and she breathed it in, and it was just air. Kohana came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her, looking at the canyon entrance as she was, as if they were both observing the same thing. "He will try again," Kohana said. "Maybe," she said, "but not today." She turned to look at him, "and I have more days than he thinks I do." He looked at her then, and what was in it was not the assessment of the first night or the care of the days since. It was recognition. She had said a thing, and he had recognized it from the inside. "Yes," he said, "you do." The child, the one who had touched her hair, appeared at her side and took her hand with the calm authority of a child who has decided something and sees no reason to negotiate about it. Nora looked down at her. The small hand was warm and certain in hers. She stood in the winter light of the canyon with a child holding her hand on one side and Kohana beside her on the other, and the thing at the base of her throat, that held thing, that 10-year held thing, finally, completely, let go. She breathed once fully. That was all, that was enough.